All right, welcome everybody to the second episode of the Nylon Calculus Analytics Salon. If you missed our first edition, which you probably did, it was in August right after we launched. The idea was to sort of emulate salons from the 1800s, gather a group of intellectuals. In our case, we'll put intellectuals in air quotes, but basketball analytics experts. And have a live conversation about different issues. So we did an episode in August with Kevin Farragon, Ben Dowsett, and Nathan Walker, and Jacob Rosen, and we talked about Dion Waiters and Bradley Beal and what analytics had to say about the two of them and the comparisons between the two. So today we're going to talk about shot selection. We have Hal Brown, Seth Partnow, and Krishna Narsu, and they're all contributors for Nylon Calculus, and you can find their work lots of other places as well. They certainly don't limit themselves. So we're planning on talking about an hour. We'll meander through a couple different things, and the episode will be up recorded on the website too. So if you can't stick around for the whole thing now, you can always catch up later. So we're talking about shot selection, the message that basketball analytics has to offer on shot selection. We've gotten a lot more data this year with the new SportView shot logs and all that stuff. So we'll start with Hal. So for you, what's the message that basketball analytics has on the issue of shot selection?
Well, I mean, so you go back to the sort of original point being made by this sort of big discovery that, or not discovery, but that expected value is an important concept in understanding how efficient a shot is, how good a decision is, with the idea that, well, you multiply the probability by the output you get, and you're going to get some approximation of what you can expect every time you take a shot. And the finding being, well, a three-point shot is more valuable than we thought, because if you're shooting at league average rates, a three-pointer that's only a 28% shot is still probably better than a league average long two, right? And there's been a lot of, I think, interest in almost proving that wrong since that discovery. You know, a lot of people who really want to sort of go through and say, like, hey, here's why this may not be true, or something along those lines. And I think a lot of that comes from the idea that what that seemed to teach is that a three-pointer is just more valuable than a two-point shot, which I think anyone who watches basketball, including analysts, understands is not sort of that simple. And so the sort of goal for a lot of people, analysts in particular, has been to go through and find ways in which where we can describe how this is more complicated than it's sort of been made. And so with a lot of the data released this year, there's been a lot of nice movement towards that, with the cases of how close how close a defender is on a shot, how likely their shot is, how good their shot is after a few dribbles. Especially because one of the big problems is you sort of know intuitively, well, yeah, okay, even a contested three-point shot at 28% might be better than a league average long two, right? But someone taking a contested, off-the-dribble, leaning fadeaway three at the end of the clock instead of a leaning two isn't necessarily a better shot, and we sort of know that. And so how do we go through and have that? Well, now we've got that data, right? So I think what we're seeing now is a movement towards not necessarily instances of saying, like, oh, the basic expected value is wrong, but understanding the nuances of how having an elite two-point shooter like LaMarcus Aldridge or Dirk Nowitzki opens up the floor for other three-point shooters, or how having a particular type of three-point shot changes the expected value, how different shots in different circumstances changes the expected value, which I think is all important, because everyone's immediate reaction was, we don't have the right circumstances, we don't have the right context, we can't break this down into the decision-making process. And I think we're starting to get the data where we can start looking at decisions and saying, well, if I know that this and this is true about the shot percentages on these contexts, what types of decisions do we have to start making now? And
And partially by design, we have Seth and Krishna who have done as much work as anybody in talking about that granular level of shot selection and taking it to that more detailed level. So, so Seth, what's for you? What's the message on shot selection and analytics?
Oh, I'm glad I'm glad Tim mentioned the kind of decision-making process, because as we're starting to get some more of this data and get into it a little bit more, I'm a little worried that we're kind of going down the route that maybe we did with kind of rebounding and kind of in the first round of what might be called like sabermetric box score analysis is. We know these individual shots are good or bad based on time on the shot clock, contest distance, stuff like that. But the assignment of credit to an individual player for all of the shot selection is maybe the next thing to really think about in terms of these shots are the endpoint of a complicated process that we, analytically speaking, don't really understand very well at all. I think I talked about it in a post I think last week where we know in a certain spot you want to get a 3-pointer, go for the win, you're down 2 with 5 seconds left. All right, how do you do that? And any sort of model of that is something that's, I think, beyond our capabilities right now. So while I think the granular level of detail is starting to reveal more about those decisions, it hasn't necessarily revealed more about the interactions between, mentioning guys like Dirk Nowitzki or LaMarcus Aldridge, who shoot, mid-range shots pretty well. Does that have value? Does that have value versus specific types of defense? You talk about a team like Houston with their very extreme don't shoot mid-range philosophy. How well does having a team so geared to that and having players so geared to that work when you're playing against a disciplined team, especially in a playoff setting that's kind of prepared for defending, reductively 2 spots on the floor? Does that make it harder for you in that environment? And we're just starting to, I think, be able to look into that kind of question, which is more, I want to say, useful in terms of application than kind of, these shots are good, shoot good shots, which is that's nice, but it's not an especially actionable piece of advice, I think.
Yeah, and so Krishna, a lot of your work has been with the chronological component here, which is that the expected value of shots changes depending on where they come in the shot clock, and some of that is the other factors, defense and dribbles. So what do you see as the message, and how does the work that you've done factor into this?
Well, I mean, first of all, one of the things I noticed is there's a lot of contested dribble mid-range shots taken. Not towards the end of the shot clock, but from like 5 seconds towards like 20 seconds and stuff. And that's a shot that I think, how many players can actually hit that type of shot at an acceptable rate? So that's the type of shot that I think we need to see less of. The question is kind of, of course, as Seth was saying, is how do you get there? Who's, different players obviously have different percentages and stuff. There's still a lot we don't know. As I looked at it in a post earlier, also, defense tightens up in the clutch. Not necessarily on the shots you take, but on the shots you don't take. Because on those shots you don't take, somebody's guarding you. You're choosing not to shoot then, and you're gonna go later in the shot clock to look for a shot you can find. And so there's just so many different areas we can kind of explore. One of the things. One of the different strategy changes, actually, I was thinking is, and I found this, with advantage data, is that contested and there's no difference between contested and pressured shots on above the break threes. And with advantage data, so they have hand up is contested 0 to 3 feet, pressured is 0 to 3 feet without the hand up, and there's no difference on the percentages at above the break. There was a difference on the corner three, so. Maybe a question is, do you try to risk fouling? Do you risk fouling the shooter to get your hand up when it might not make that much of a difference, or you run out to the shooter. There's a lot of different questions like that. And then, of course, you have different aspects, like, obviously players' height could affect contesting and stuff like that. There's just a lot of different variables, and we still, still don't know that much. But at the same time, there's...
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's a really interesting point that you made, that that we are dealing with data that's increasingly detailed, but also some of the most important data is the events that don't happen. So if a player chooses to take a off the dribble long 2-pointer, that we get that as a data point, as a contested long 2-pointer or whatever off the dribble, but we don't see the other options that were on the floor, and whether we don't necessarily get to compare the expected value of that shot to the expected values of the other possibilities on that possession, and sometimes maybe there's better possibilities, and sometimes maybe there's not. So it's almost like some of the most important data is the things that don't happen, that thus are not tracked.
Yeah, and that's a lot of the data we don't capture. That's kind of, and that's one area that we can get as much data as we want, but we're never going to be able to really capture that part. That's the I guess that's the area where you got to watch film. You can't catch that necessarily with the data. But at the same time, if you're taking like a contested off the dribble mid-range shot, like 16 seconds, I mean, how many players can? I don't even think the best mid-range shooter can hit that shot at an acceptable rate that early in the shot clock. So I think that's the type of shot that we could do with less. And there's a lot of teams that take those type of shots.
Yeah. So this would be a question for all three, and we can start with Tim. But Seth and I talked about this a little bit on the podcast a couple weeks ago. So what about the idea that it seems like the more data we have, the more we realize the importance of the level of detail and context, and how every shot is ultimately about these really specific detailed points, who takes the shot and how close is the defender and what's the game situation and what else is happening on the floor. And is there a point where the detail is so valuable, or the detail is so important in determining the outcome in terms of value, that it's sort of counterproductive to draw large conclusions? I don't know if that made sense at all.
No, it did. And I think I can understand that, getting the concern that you get like so deep into the data that you're basically just back to watching games and making conclusions off of what you see, which we already know we can't, isn't a great way of doing things, in part because we're all biased. We all have many, many different cognitive biases that we're born with and implanted with, and our eyes lie to us. So that's why we use the numbers the way we do. But I think every time we get somewhere into that data, one way or another, we learn new things. So like without this large scale, here's the what happens about the value of three-pointers and shots at the rim, and value of free throws versus value of mid-range shots, and look what happened to the Rockets. The Rockets are a completely new team now. That was a large, and lots of teams are. Every team is taking more threes now, and that's a big decision. That changes how teams play around to get three-point shots. I did an analysis at one point where I found that there's sort of a loose parabolic relationship between the amount of shots you take from any given location and how well your team performs against elite defenses. Meaning that, so I looked at a more granular set of data that's still nowhere near what we're getting from Vantage or SportView, and said, well, okay, it looks like if you over-rely on a three-point shot or mid-range shots or trying to get to the rim, your defenses are going to be able to key onto that. Really good defenses are going to be able to key onto that thing you're over-reliant on or don't have enough of, and they're going to punish you for it. Versus if you're more variable, you're better off. And then, that's digging in a bit and still getting valuable information. And then, there's all this conversation about, well, then what happens when you get to the more granular data of the big, because the big question being, well, okay, if threes and shots at the rim are great, how do you get those, right? I believe that that's Seth's big question, right? That's like in theory, this is all super, but how do you get that? And you don't have to get to the point where the data is so granular it's irrelevant to start answering those questions.
Mm-hmm. So Seth, I know this is something that you have worked on, and looking at you looked also at the Rockets and how they have played compared to some of the top defenses in the league, and so to some degree, can we say that shot selection and the data around it is a moving target, because defenses have the same information that offenses have, and as offenses change their patterns, defenses change to adjust, which then changes the equation even further, and maybe move some of the offensive expected values.
Absolutely. What I could sort of wanted to not totally dispute, but a little bit dispute something Krishna said earlier. Is you talk about kind of the mid-range shots. A lot of the stuff we're talking about in terms of ideal shot selection is kind of assuming kind of more or less game theory optimal defense. However, if you have a guy like LaMarcus Aldridge, this is something that's kind of revealing itself as we look more and more, is that the using Aldridge specifically, kind of the influence, the threat of the perceived threat of his mid-range shooting is what's driving things rather than the actual proficiency from that area. So if a defense is reacting to him shooting those shots more than they should, which based on his accuracy from those shots in the last year and a half, they might be, then okay. And then in an ideal world, maybe he shouldn't be taking those shots. But if the defense is going to almost sell out towards preventing those shots, then him taking those shots does open these other things up. So and that's kind of one of those things that we're talking about a process that we can't really see yet. We can observe it in kind of some on-off data that the rest of the Blazers starters last year shot much better with Aldridge on the floor because the defense, however you want to term it, the defense was rolling towards him or they're double teaming to get the ball out of his hands, and maybe that wasn't wise for the defense from a pure analytics standpoint, but it's also sort of an exercise in psychology and playing the game on the floor. There's things that are perceived threats that might not match up perfectly with kind of what's analytically indicated, and so that matters too. If the defense is going to react to something, then doing that thing might be better than it is might instantly appear to be. Did that make any sense at all?
Yeah, no, that made sense.
Okay.
And so, to you then, Krishna, so are there places where teams are still exploiting are teams still exploiting misunderstandings by defenses, and should I know Aldridge, punished the Rockets last year early in that series, but should the Rockets and other teams who play the Trailblazers, should they be playing the percentages differently and maybe letting somebody take those long two-pointers, even if they're good, even if they're great? Aldridge can beat us from 22 feet, but Wes Matthews and Nick Batum are not going to beat us from the three-point line, kind of thing.
Well, I mean, Aldridge can beat you for 22 feet, So, I mean, certainly if you have a great player like that, who can hit that, high percentage mid-range shot, you don't necessarily want to just give it to them as a defense. I mean, certainly it might be, preferable than somebody dunking the ball, obviously, but, at the same time, the Blazers showed last year, those shots can win a series. And, I think, Seth's got a good point where you're just kind of eliminating the entire, portion of the court by not, by not shooting a mid-range shot, by if your shot selection is that skewed that teams know you're not going to shoot from there, those shots, not taken, they don't even have to cover that area. They're just kind of focused on the 3-point line and the rim. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think, I mean, there's certain players, where you gotta prepare for their mid-range game, and I think the question of whether you definitely want to be near them. You definitely want to be pressuring them. Getting your hand up, from what I've seen, on those type of shots, there doesn't seem to be too much of a difference. But you got to be right in their face. You got to pressure them. So yeah.
So will we see? We'll go back to Tim and swing around again. So the change we've seen in shot selection patterns over the past couple of years is steadily league-wide more 3-pointers, more shots at the rim, less long 2-pointers. Is that trend? Is that trend going to continue in sort of a linear fashion, or is there a point where defenses adjusting and overplaying for those sorts of things will change the equation enough that maybe the pattern either levels off, or maybe teams sort of move back to long 2-pointers because there's an advantage there, and maybe a market inefficiency in terms of a player with that skill set?
I mean, I think it's going to keep getting a little more drastic for the moment, but it will level off. I don't think we're going to go back to long 2s anytime soon, only because even if those shots are valuable in the sense that they open up the shots that we want for other people, there's still a limited efficiency, even if if their main utility is getting more efficient shots later on, there's still a limited value in what they can bring, even for barring a Dirk Nowitzki or Marcus Aldridge. And I think in particular the question comes up with this can't get too crazy, I suppose, only because there's a point where you have to get 3-pointers and shots at the rim. And this is especially true of shots at the rim, in the sense that 3-pointers, you can kind of decide you want to shoot to an extent, but you can't just decide you're going to shoot at the rim, right? I mean, getting to the rim is really hard. And I remember one time, I sort of, not totally successfully, but I tried to figure out what the utility is of once you decide you're going to shoot at the rim, what is your actual expected value? Because so many of those times what's going to happen is you're going to jack up a contested floater in the paint, which is a horrible shot.
Yeah.
So, for that, to that extent, teams aren't going to just rapidly increase their shots at the rim, if only because they can't just decide they're going to do that. And they can increase threes to an extent, and I think they will. But I also think they're going to recognize that you get greater value out of getting better threes if you have some mid-range shooters. But I do think there's still a limit to the value that those mid-range shots bring. So I think what we're still sort of looking at in terms of the analytics is where is that sort of maximal value? Where can we sort of maximize all of this, optimize it? And that's easier said than done, but I do think we're also getting close to being able to do that.
Okay. So, Seth, maybe I want to just add one more thing in as we go to you. I'm thinking about the how pace factors into this, and so maybe a team like the Rockets, where the fact that defenses know they're going to not take long 2-pointers unless they absolutely can't avoid it. So maybe that shrinks the marginal advantage of their shot pattern slightly, but upping the pace, speeding it up, getting more possessions over the course of the game. Does that then extend the advantage? I'm thinking about their D-League affiliate that plays at an even much faster pace than the Rockets do, and sticks to that shot pattern maybe even more in the extreme.
I don't know about that, because I think that that like all things, both teams have a role to play in the pace, and I think that's something Krishna touched on earlier in terms of the shots not taken. I think that's a big part of why the pace slows in the playoffs, is because those early good shots, teams are playing better defense, so those early good shots don't exist because the defense is playing better. And so that's one of those things that I wonder if it really, when you increase kind of the level of play, especially defensively, which I think is probably bigger difference between kind of D League and NBA play is increase the level of defense than just deciding, well, we're going to play faster becomes harder. There are kind of two other strands worth talking about here. One, I think I'll touch on briefly, and that's kind of continuing with the notion of defense having an effect here, and that's, I think, that the increase in, the continuing increase in kind of three-pointers especially, I think that's more of an issue with defense again than with offense. I think if defenses continue to, I don't want to say overreact, but to some extent overreact to the kind of, the mid-range shot, we have to get the ball out of this guy's hands. Someone, a player is posting up at 12 feet, and he's a guy against a credible post defender. One example is Dwight Howard against Robin Lopez. My thought is that if you're the Blazers, and this is how the Blazers do it, you're probably better off. Okay, go ahead, Dwight Howard. Do something from 12 feet there, and sometimes it's going to work, but it's on balance that's going to be better than running a guy at him and then you're giving up 3-pointers or drives and stuff like that.
Gotcha.
So. And
all right.
I lost my train of thought after that, but.
No worries. So, Krishna, your thoughts on long-term trends for shot selection?
Actually, well, I just had a thought about the whole kind of shots not taken and defense, getting tighter and stuff in the playoffs. And I don't know if this study has been done yet or anything like that, but I was just thinking about pace in close games. Say you're a faster-paced team, and you get in a close game and the pace inevitably tightens. It slows down because you're getting shots later in the shot clock because the defense is tighter. Is your team as a faster-paced team more likely to struggle in that situation than, say, a team who normally plays slow? A Memphis Grizzlies type team. They normally play slow, and I think the Grizz have been really good in the clutch this year. Now, of course, that's not any long-term trend, but does a slower-paced team like that, gain some advantage because the shots, because they're kind of used to that pace, at the end of the game when the defense is tighter, they're used to that slower pace. I mean, I don't know if that makes any sense, but
yeah, no, I totally. Andrew Koo, who's another one of our colleagues at Nylon Calculus, did something for Hickory High a couple years ago on pace, and I don't remember the exact findings, but my recollection is he was sort of looking at the disparity in pace between teams that played fast and slow, and so if a fast team plays a slow team, is the pace more likely to be fast or slow, and how's the performance of the teams? And I think if I remember correctly, generally the slower-paced team had a greater impact on the pace of the game than a fast-paced team. But I don't think there was, if I remember correctly, I don't think there was in the large scheme. I don't think there was an impact on performance. But I would have to dig that up. It was probably 3 years ago.
Right.
So maybe switching gears here for a second, we'll go back to you, Tim. So what would you like to know about shot selection that we either don't have the data for or we haven't been able to figure out in a satisfactory way? And maybe this is things that that we are not capable of tracking, or maybe this is things that teams are tracking and we don't know anything about it because it's proprietary and behind closed doors.
I mean, so I've got a couple different answers to that, but most touch on things that I've already mentioned. So, the main thing I'd really like to know is what's the expected value of a decision to shoot at the rim?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is the probability that once someone has decided they want to shoot at the rim, they actually get to the rim, that they draw a free throw, that they take a floater, and what are the sort of values of all those different things meshed together? Turnovers, right? There's a lot of information in there, and there's a lot of assumptions we make about shots at the rim. And I think as far as shot selection goes, that's the thing we're the farthest away from understanding. And I think we're close to having that information, but sort of knowing the big trick is sort of you have to get into a player's head and know when that decision has been made, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard. So I think one thing we can do is look at, okay, well, this player is driving. Given that he's driving, given that he's started to drive and ends the play with a shot, under how many instances does he put up a layup, put up a floater, get a free throw, right? And that's not going to be a perfect approximation, but I think it's close, and we almost have that data if we don't already. But I'd also like to know, in that thing where I mentioned earlier about the parabolic relationship between the amount of shots from different locations. I use only 1 year of data for that because when I went back, I believe I went back a whole 5 years, that relationship was not the same. So I'm wondering if that's a legitimate relationship that defenses are changing so that they're allowing teams who only shoot threes or only shoot mid-range shots or only shoot at the rim from scoring well. Like if defenses are getting better in that sense, or if that was just like 1 year small sample size. So I'd be curious to know how that works as well. And I think that's kind of where I lie, at least as far as my interest goes.
Okay. How about you, Seth?
Kind of the dream data is I think it was one of the versions of like NBA Jam. If one of the cheat codes you plugged in, and when you took a shot that wasn't a dunk, it kind of popped up above your player's head, like the theoretical shot percentage of a given shot, and that's kind of because a lot of what we're talking about is we're talking earlier about well, he can beat you from there. Well, even kind of a pretty bad shot is an NBA player is going to make it at a 40% rate. So if a guy takes that shot 5 times in a row, there's going to be plenty of times where he hits 4 out of 5 just based on on luck, shooting well, hot hand, however it works. So especially from a defensive perspective, kind of knowing kind of that theoretical percentage of a given shot might make it a little easier to react defensively than, oh, he's killing us there, rather than are we giving up 2 good shots, or is the guy just making tough shots? And that seems like that's kind of from both sides of the ball. That's still the tough part is we can only react on each shot whether it goes in or not, and in a broad perspective, we know these are bad shots, these are good shots, but still very hard on a an individual basis to say, the extremes are a super contested mid-range shot, okay, that's obviously bad, or a wide open 3 or layup, those are obviously good, but in between there, we're still very reliant on a shot going in or not in our watching the game to decide whether that was a good shot, whatever. And so knowing more about kind of, and it's unknowable, I think, just because but in terms of dream data, that's kind of where it would be cool to get to.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Krishna?
Well, actually, I was just thinking, I was just thinking back to the whole shots not taken, and if you could have, I suppose this would kind of be like infinite data set almost, but like having the locations of each player, at each second in the shot clock, or at each time, and kind of seeing, and you have like an expected value there for, what are the chances they can make a shot from there. That would be some way of getting at the whole shots not taken. Of course, you're talking about that would be a massive, massive data set. I mean, you're talking about probably millions of data points there. I mean, just looking at the position of every player at each point in the shot clock, or
so isn't that the
Sport
EPV
view.
project that Kirk Goldsberry?
That's what I was thinking.
He had the two research assistants. Isn't that kind of what they had last year?
I think so, right? I mean, I think they include other aspects though in there, like screen, that.
Yeah. I think they recalculated for each action, but so if I remember correctly,
but I was just talking from the shots.
Just from the shot perspective. Okay. Because I was with the Goldsberry thing, if I remember correctly, the limitations there was the computing power that was required to work that stuff out. It was not something that could be done in real time. So on some level, is the limit of this a technical limitation, maybe?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, if any of us wanted to do that, let me tell you right now, I don't. Unless you guys have like computers with a lot of computing power, none of us could do this.
Well,
we gotta have, whole.
I mean, if Harvard's supercomputer that they have in the school can't do it, I think it's pretty safe to say.
Yeah, well, there you go.
If
Harvard's supercomputer can't do it, then we sure as hell have.
Yeah, although, as soon as he mentioned that, I did want to bring up, I mean, the EPV is a dream, right? If we can get that tells us so much we want to know. That in itself basically tells us the creation power of a mid-range shot. We can't speculate anymore. We have that. It tells us how good point guards are at creating the shots. It tells us how good, like, someone who moves off the ball is at creating a shot. And the sort of shot creation aspect of shot selection seems to be the most confusing, and that just answers that off the bat. And so that's the dream, but it seems so far away right now.
So I know I'm just supposed to be facilitating here, but I wanted to throw out one thing that I'm really curious about, and I don't know how you would ever sort of measure this because it's psychological, but I'm really curious about the way coaches instruct their teams on shot selection and how that affects patterns, and the fact that Byron Scott saying in the offseason that he wanted them to take 10 3-pointers a game, how does that affect Wes Johnson when he's open on the 3-point line and presented with a shot that maybe is a good shot numerically, but then is he hesitating and it's like, is this what coach really wants me to do? I don't know if anybody has thoughts on that side.
Well, I think that
I got a I was just gonna say, why would you ever say like I'm going to take 10 3-point attempts again? Like, why would you ever say anything about your shot selection? That should be something a team has to figure out. Don't give anything away. I mean,
it seems like bad strategy on a couple. Yeah. Did you have something you wanted to add, Seth?
No, I think we're seeing a little bit of that kind of uncertainty. I think that Kevin Love so far in Cleveland, this is maybe getting slightly outside of analytics and into psychoanalytics, I guess. But I think it's kind of evident that he's searching for where his shots are gonna come from. Where he was, and this is kind of something that who is it? Jacob Rosen, who's working on something showing that offensive ratings kind of go up over the course of a season, and how much of that is players becoming more familiar with where their shots are going to come, and just being a coaching cue is be shot ready. Well, if you know where your shots are coming, you're shot ready. It's a mindless act to catch and shoot, and that's a jump shot is a complicated physical movement, and if you're thinking about various parts of it, it's harder to do. So if it just happens, more automatically because you are anticipating and knowing when something's happening, it strikes me that would be hard not to be more efficient, be better shooting. So. That coaching cue, knowing like, yes, the coach has faith in me to take this shot. This is a good shot. I'm going to catch it and shoot it. That has to help almost, unless it's a shot that should never be shooting. Like for some reason telling Josh Smith, yes, shoot all you want.
Well,
I think that's an outlier.
Yeah.
and I think that's something you see outside of just coaching too. I mean, and I guess I'm being a little sort of questionable with my terms and delineations here, but like, and I say this as a Mavs fan and Mavs blogger, so of course I'm predispositioned to think of that team. But like, you look at Chandler Parsons, who last year in Houston had just this constant green light to shoot threes, and he did all the time. And now in Dallas, he's clearly very obviously more concerned about that. He's not shooting them as often. He's pump faking and driving more, which is fine. But he just looks like his confidence is shaken in the shot. If only because that green light, being taken from a team where they say shoot threes all the time to a team where it's driving kick or sometimes shoot or whatever, having to sort of make that decision instead of just sort of it being given, I think is changing the thought process. So I think that sort of psychological question applies not just to coaching and but to larger team philosophies and to sometimes just the individual players themselves who put it in the situation.
So is there something? Is there then some sort of added benefit in the Rocket system that maybe we haven't identified in the fact that that they maybe have although we think of their shot selection pattern as being really specific and really tight, in many ways it's also really loose, because it's like, just don't shoot from there, and anywhere else is sort of okay, and we'd like to be open, but we're flexible on that as long as you're shooting from these areas. And so does that then create some sort of a sort of a psychological freedom for players in knowing that I don't necessarily have to worry about how close I am or how many times I've shot this quarter or who else has gotten touches and who hasn't. I just need to make sure I'm either at the rim or behind this line.
I think that we're maybe oversimplifying, and I think how much of that is a philosophy of kind of coaching and instruction, and how much of that is a philosophy of team assembly, in terms of Daryl Morey going out and getting guys who shoot in these places, rather than the guys that happen to be on the team being told only shoot in these places. So it's maybe a little kind of chicken or egg thing, and assigning all that value to kind of a coaching / gameplay philosophy versus this is what the players they have do and the players they look for. And to some extent, I mean, with their deadly team franchise, obviously, players they're looking to mold, because I think players at that level are probably more malleable than those that are already in the NBA. So I would be hesitant to go too far down the route of making a prescription based on this is what Houston tells their players to do, therefore they're more comfortable. It's just it's a correlation causation thing that it's easy to get ahead of ourselves, but I'm not sure it's justified to do so.
Okay. So go ahead, Krishna.
Well, I was going to say, at the same time, if, and completely hypothetical here, but, if the Rockets, someone like LaMarcus Aldridge or Dirk became available somehow, highly unlikely, but, if the Rockets got one of those players, would they, sit there and tell them don't shoot from, mid-range and just,
well, and Morey
would they make them try to expand their range?
Yeah. Well, Morey has acknowledged, right, that if they had Nowitzki or Aldridge, that their shot selection pattern would look different.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's what I was saying. That their shot selection. So there is definitely some aspect of the Rockets kind of telling their players to shoot. It's not just that they're going out and looking for players. They're also telling their players, we want you guys shooting from these areas.
All right, so we'll go back to Tim and then maybe kind of whip around. So given all of the things that we've talked about here, take a generic nondescript team. How does a team use this sort of information to sort of build from the ground up and make sure that they have an efficient offense? combining the macro trends, threes are better than twos, and the micro trends of that it all matters. The individual context of the shot is really what matters.
Oh, well, I mean, I think we're still sort of learning enough about this that it still comes down to sort of the basics that we know, right? What you want is you want a superstar, however that superstar operates, either with mid-range shots or with three-pointers or shots to the rim, because having that player opens it up for everybody else. There's still some questions about whether Carmelo Anthony is as helpful as a Dirk Nowitzki or something, or as a LeBron James, I guess, and probably isn't, but still probably better to have a Carmelo Anthony than to have Danny Green.
Danilo Gallinari.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's so we still start at that point, right? But I think from there we know, well, if you have someone like that who can go out and get buckets, as they say, from everywhere, you can then fill around. You can then fill it around with the people we know are more valuable, those 3 and D players, and we haven't even really talked about defense, and that's such an important part of team building. That, like, if you're asking me how do you build a team around shot selection, I probably actually say, well, I'm going to build my team around defense first, and then worry about that. So that's sort of. Yeah, but to the extent that I build around shot selection, I want someone who can bend defenses to them, get people to focus on them, make smart passes, and recognize where they're moving the defense around. Your Steph Currys, your LaMarcus Aldridges, your Dirk Nowitzki. I need that guy, and then I can fill them around with, one Andre Iguodala who can do a little bit of everything. One Danny Green who can shoot, or several Danny Greens who can shoot a lot of threes, ideally, right? Like that's sort of the dream, someone who can shoot a lot of threes, someone who's really flexible and can get to the rim, and then someone who can do everything. That's kind of the goal, I think.
What do you think, Seth?
I think touched on sort of something related to my general philosophy is there, in terms of quality offensive players, there's sort of, and this is reductive, but there's kind of 2 types. There's kinds that can create defensive mistakes and kinds that can punish defensive mistakes. And, a lot of these, the shots at the rim and threes come as a result of, you force the defense to have 2 guys guard the ball at some point. Is basically the either I'm shooting a layup or 2 guys are going to have to stop me. Is kind of the very basic. And so from there and in terms of application, I almost think what that means is that's more at a coaching level, designing your offense in such a way where you're putting players in situations where they have easy decisions to make to create those situations. This is something that when Matt Moore did an interview with Jeff Hornacek at the early part of last year, he was talking about how he used analytics, and he wasn't super detailed or anything like that. He's like, you're pretty good from that spot, go there, and that's in terms of again playing the game in that sort of flow. And it's something you kind of talked about with respect to Randy Whitman and Byron Scott in a piece you wrote probably about a month ago, I'd say, is put the players in situations where the decisions they make are likely to lead to those good shots, and either threatening situation where they're going to get an open shot or drawing a double team. It's kind of it's hard, but you're making these decisions based on analytics almost before you get to the court, because doing these kind of calculations, in game it's not. I don't think it's realistic to ask.
Okay. So Krishna, we want to set patterns. How else do teams use shot selection to their advantage? I mean, what are the big lessons there?
Well, I think. Well, one aspect is kind of looking at it from defensively. what type of how do you gear your defense? Obviously, maybe you allow a team to shoot more mid-range. You really try to protect the freeze and rim, and so you're allowing more mid-range shots. But when a player like LaMarcus Aldridge, you're going against him, how do you guard? Where does he fall? So he farther than that? Are you suddenly more concerned about guarding that mid-range area than maybe you would be if you're facing a team that, like the Rockets, maybe who don't take any mid-range shots? So certainly that's an aspect where as Seth mentioned, that's all like pre-game kind of strategy and stuff like that. And there's all sorts of stuff. I mean, we dig even deeper, and this is going to get really, really detailed right here, but it's something I was sort of interested in a while back. Is you always hear the Mark Jackson, hand down, man down, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you have someone like Shane Battier, you put the hand in your face, right? So where so if you're like coming at them from like really far or something, you get the hand in the face. Does that make a difference as opposed to like maybe if your hand is like off to the side, or if you're like how does all that like is basically different ways to contest the shot, like or maybe you're running at a player instead. Instead of going out there to put your hand up, you're running at the player and like running at his like midsection or something like that, and trying to like force them off balance, or like something like that would be kind of interesting to see. Like different types of ways to like pressure that shooter so he's missing the shot.
Yeah, or my pickup move, which is clapping and shouting. When a player goes up for a shot, I'm not close enough. I'm just going to clap and yell at you. Maybe blow in your ear if I'm close enough. All right, so we've been going for almost an hour, so we'll spin this home with one last thing. So for people who are learning about analytics, who are getting started, who are curious about this information on shot selection, so give us just a sentence or two. What would you like the average fan to know about analytics and shot selection?
It's really complicated, and it's not a matter of threes and shots at the rim are what you only need to take and never take a mid-range shot, but they are more valuable, and if you can find ways to create the two, that's the goal.
All right. Seth?
Try to find a way to ignore whether a particular shot goes in or not. That's the hardest thing to do because we're results oriented. But it's the expression I love is it's a make or miss league. So to some extent, it's a little bit random whether shots go in or not, and whether a particular shot goes in or not has, aside from extreme cases, has very little to do with whether it was a good shot or not. The best shot you're going to find in a NBA offense is, more or less is something that's maybe a 60% true shooting kind of shot, whereas the worst is 40%. So there's to the naked eye, that's hard to tell the difference between those two, but that's kind of the money is made moving kind of between the bottom and top of that range on a possession by possession basis.
Okay. All right, Krishna?
The 4 words: shot selection is complicated. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, it's obviously simple in the fact that, well, make or miss, but you have your shots not taken, you have your shots taken. Who's shooting, where are you shooting from, type of defense. There's all sorts of different aspects, and it's kind of amazing that NBA players kind of they make all these decisions in like a split second, and yet here we all are like analyzing like down to the last these really down to detail, very detailed, and yet these players are just kind of it just comes naturally what type of shot. For some players obviously, but yeah, I mean, it's just kind of it's very complicated, and obviously you have like I was saying, player defense type and stuff like that. So yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for. I don't know if everybody's on vacation. I obviously am, if you can tell from my unshowered bedhead here. But yeah, thanks for spending your morning talking about shot selection, and had a great time. And hopefully we can keep these analytics salons going. Maybe just one time through, and you guys can promote yourselves a little bit. I've got Twitter handles in the show notes, but if you want to mention Twitter handles and anywhere else people can find your work.
Yeah, I'm at Hal Brown NBA.
And I realize we've been calling you Hal and Tim.
Yeah, I had to create the name Hal as a bin name because Tim is my editor at Mavs Moneyball, and that would be too complicated. But I am at Mavs Moneyball. I'm at Nylon Calculus. You can find me at both places. I've written before at Analytics Game and Beale Street Bears. So if you're looking for old work, it's all over there. And yeah, I also would just like to acknowledge that I feel like we all just got schooled really hard by Seth to be. And every time he said anything, I felt super inferior. So anyway, that's where you can find me, and we'll move on.
Sorry. That wasn't my intent. Well, maybe it was. Okay. At Seth Partnow on Twitter. I write too many places to list. I try to update kind of every place I publish at. I have a Tumblr where I post links. It's sethpartnow.tumblr.com. And let me see. I just posted last night. I guess I just updated some a bunch of my favorite sport view metrics, and I'm going to try to keep updating those over the course of the year, including rim protection, where Sam Dallenberg somehow is the most effective rim protector in the league so far this year. So who knew? Anyway.
And Krishna, you're at Nylon Calculus, and where else are you writing?
Okay, Twitter handle is at knarsu3, and yeah, you can find me now on Calculus at Vantage Sports, and I'll be joining B-Ball Breakdown, and writing there at some point.
Great, that's great to hear, and hopefully in an NBA front office sometime soon.
Yeah, hopefully.
All right, thanks everybody for joining us. All 6 of you who are currently watching live, thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time.